So hello, dear viewers of our live stream, and hello, audience here at the AM4U stage. I hope you had a wonderful lunch break and are ready to get more highlights here from the AM4U stage at Formnext 2022. We will start the afternoon with an exciting expert insights, and I would like to introduce to you Dr. Jennifer Johns from the University of Bristol, UK, who will introduce us to the topic Reconfiguring International Supply Chains, Distributed Manufacturing, and the Role of AM. I would like to encourage you again to follow carefully and ask questions via the comment function, because then I get them live here on the screen and can ask Jennifer afterwards your question here on stage and get your answer. So please, welcome with me, Dr. Jennifer Johns. Jennifer, stage is yours.
Thank you.
Clicker, by the way.
Thanks, everyone, and good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here today at Formnext. I've been coming for many years and watched this great trade show grow. I'm here on behalf of a team of people. We have a booth over in Hall 11.1, so please come and see us. We're an interdisciplinary team of engineers and people from a business school, so I'm a management scholar. And we're using interdisciplinary approaches to try and solve some of the world's real problems and challenges for manufacturing at the moment. And we're all quite aware of trends and issues and problems in supply chains. And I wanted to make today a connection for us between those supply chains issues and how it creates challenges, but significantly opportunities for additive manufacturing. So I'm going to talk through today some of the patterns of the changes that we're seeing in supply chains and thinking about some of the ways we as academics are working with industry to come up with solutions to help further application and the development of additive manufacturing. So please do come and see us if you want to see some of the work we're doing. I'll talk more about the projects at the end in brief, but I wanted to set that broader context for us today about the contemporary global economy and situate some of this amazing technological activity we see at Formnext in the bigger picture around the global economy. So I don't really need to tell the audience that we have supply chains now that appear to be more vulnerable than they have been in the past. This is through a combination of different factors: environmental challenges, COVID challenged our supply chain networks, and we're seeing issues around our logistics, and we're having some downstream supply problems. I've been using the Ever Given as my graphic for a while. I thought change was needed, so I have this cargo ship tipping over. And that symbolizes for us some of the very real everyday challenges that firms globally are facing around their supply networks. We can broadly characterize longer supply chains as being more vulnerable. It's harder to monitor and control your relationships with your suppliers if they're more geographically extensive. That's a broad assumption, but it can present challenges, and it also can be harder for you to monitor the quality of your supply when you have geographically extensive supply chains. We know from the work that we're doing with businesses that there's now a tendency within firms to question the models that they're using to make their offshoring supply decisions. There has been a propensity in the contemporary global economy for companies to offshore based on calculations and modeling that sometimes can overlook some very significant dynamics. One of those can be supply issues. It can also be the costs of maintaining those extensive supply chains. And we know from our conversations that firms are having very intense conversations at the board level often and through their procurement departments, questioning some of the assumptions around offshoring, and sourcing in low-cost economies can actually be not necessarily the right solution for firms. Some of this predated COVID, but COVID has exacerbated this. I also wanted to highlight how there's a broader context here around consumption patterns and what the consumers desire, thinking about that final end product. And we are seeing changes in consumption patterns, changes in the expectations of consumers. There's this term, the prosumer, and this is putting together production and consumption, which is in a way going back to the very start of 3D printing with the hobbyist maker spaces, about how you could design and manufacture something yourself, and essentially bypass the whole value chain of production. We're not there yet. We might be with a couple of things, but broadly speaking, we're not. But there is increased demand for customization and demand for speed of delivery. So we have to overlay these understandings of these supply chain challenges with what the end consumer is also expecting from those supply chains. I wanted to think through how we can characterize global production, and I'm going to talk about centralized, decentralized, and distributed manufacturing. And from what I've observed within manufacturing and additive manufacturing is sometimes a confusion and overlap of understanding about what those three terms mean. And I think it's really important for us to understand those spatial dynamics so we can understand where AM can be deployed in order to change and improve supply chains. Now, this is showing centralized production. So the graphic is stylized, it's simplified, but this idea is of a central hub that is supplying other places. Now, you could very easily see that central hub as China, the world's global factory, producing and sending out manufactured goods to the rest of the world. And this is part of a broader change through globalization, what we call the new division of labor, where we see manufacturing being located in low-cost countries, because a high percentage of production costs can be through labor. So we do see higher value activities sometimes remaining in advanced economies, and we can see a space for AM increasing the amount of those higher value activities that stay in advanced economies. We are seeing a lot of rhetoric about how some of those activities could be reshored, and I'll talk about that in a moment when I talk about decentralized production. Now, of course, all of this and globalization has been facilitated by communication and transportation technologies to support these very long, geographically extensive supply chains. And this is where the vulnerabilities are coming now. The technologies are there, but we have pressures on these supply networks that is in some ways encouraging us to think about this centralized model and whether it's sustainable. And I use the word sustainable as well in the meaning of sustainability and thinking about whether this is having too heavy an impact on the global economy in terms of environmental cost with these extensive supply chains. So we're seeing multiple pressure points asking us if this centralized model is the most efficient and effective way of producing. So that's the status quo, and now we're starting to have conversations about different models. And we're seeing some trends in the global economy that are sending us towards decentralized. But I wanted in this talk to emphasize the difference between decentralized and distributed. So first, if we look at decentralized, there's often in academia, which hasn't filtered into industry, been a conversation, a debate actually about how global the global economy is. And many academics argue that we've always had a regionalized global economy. And we can divide those regions broadly into the Americas, Europe and Africa, and Asia. And you can actually, if you look at a lot of trade data, see that most trade is between the triad economies of North America, Europe, and Japan and China. So is anything new happening? I think we are seeing a shift more towards decentralized production. And here you can see from the diagram, there's more nodes of production. And you're not seeing many of these the smaller dots are sourcing from the nearest hub. And we're not seeing many firms, countries or places connecting into more geographically distant. So you're sourcing from your nearest hub. This is kind of a hub and spoke model. This is reducing supply chain length, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your supply chains are short. They're just relatively shorter than they would have been if you were traveling the whole globe. So not all problems are solved through this model. It does distribute production more across the world into smaller hubs. Now, if we reflect on what this might mean for additive manufacturing, I don't see any substantial changes in the conversations we would have around additive, its application, or its adoption in this context. It's very much just a breaking up of the status quo into a more regionalized system. Now, thinking about the world now, this mess, this complicated mess, which is supposed to be a stylized cleaning up of the messy reality of supply chains, sees centralized status quo overlapped with decentralized. So in the confusion and the pressure and the vulnerabilities of supply chains, we're actually seeing multiple supply chains overlapping each other. So firms are now having to rely on 4 suppliers. We know that we used to use dual sourcing, and we are seeing more dual sourcing, but we're now seeing also multiple layers of sourcing because you can't rely on just 1 or 2 suppliers. Some of those supply chains will be extensive, so you may have a supplier that is from China, where it will be cheaper, but you're conscious that that shipment might not arrive, or it might be not of the right quality. So you then have to support that with a more local firm or firms. And those are often backup arrangements. And we know that firms are spending quite a lot of time worrying about their suppliers and ending up sometimes being dependent on one supplier, and that's causing friction and tension within manufacturing. Now here there's a clear role for additive, particularly in these local suppliers, who may be called upon at quite short notice because another supply relationship has ended. So a clear role then in terms of immediate need. And this speaks very much to the rationale of additive in terms of flexibility and speed of delivery. I wanted to also mention some of the rhetoric around reshoring. I'm from the UK, so I'm very conscious that there's a lot of political interest in reshoring, simply because the government hopes that it will solve all the problems of Brexit. And I'm not going to speak for the remaining 23 minutes about Brexit, because I might cry. But very politicized conversations around the idea of bringing back manufacturing from less developed nations back to advanced economies. And we're seeing lots of countries like Singapore, the US, Japan, investing quite a lot of money in the idea of reshoring manufacturing. Where this is being discussed in the firms that I talk to, we're seeing some interest in the idea to reduce these supply chain vulnerabilities by bringing things back. But as an academic, conceptually, I struggle with the idea of just picking up production and bringing it back, because it probably isn't coming back. It probably never was in the advanced economies. And actually, it's probably going to be manufactured in rather different ways when it comes to advanced economies. That is because if labor costs are particularly high in the advanced economies, then there's an interest in reducing those labor costs. And this is where digital technologies can be very important. So there's a clear involvement and rationale for digitizing your production, your manufacturing, and a real opportunity for additive manufacturing to produce things differently if they are returning back to advanced economies. So at the moment, we see this complexity and this mess, and it feels like an opportunity because so much effort, money, and energy is wasted on these very vulnerable and confusing supply chains. What we do tend to see is a kind of status quo, a kind of real resistance to moving away from centralized production. And what we as researchers are interested in what the barriers are, what the challenges are, and what the opportunities might be for a world that looks rather different. And this here is what the world could look like. So again, more hubs, but here many more hubs. And connected in a peer-to-peer network. And this solves many of the challenges that we're currently seeing. There's few geographically extensive connections, and it reduces dependency. The peer network is able to work more collaboratively in order to produce and supply. And geographical scale will matter here as well. We've gone from looking at the world and China as a hub, and actually you could overlay this distributed network at any geographical scale. This could be operating across North America. It could be operating across Greater London, for example. And when we're talking about sustainability, we would be hoping that this could be operating at a more local level in order to reduce the miles that products are moving. If the supplies are more local, then we can speed up supply, and it could be more efficient. Now, you see I've got some question marks thrown in there, and of course, in some ways, we're making some assumptions because we need to start implementing this at particular scales and starting to see how it works. So I'm raising some questions, really. We would hope it would be more efficient. Does it reduce environmental impact? Now, of course, if the miles traveled are being reduced, then that, of course, is going to help. The idea would be to have a producer and the consumer being proximate, being geographically proximate. Of course, if we start looking at this model, we then start to pay greater attention to the material supply chain. And then we will still be seeing probably extensive supply networks of materials that are supporting this distributed network, because the global distribution of materials is not geographically even. This challenges conventional supply chains and value chains. This really is a different view of the future, a very radical way of understanding how the global economy could be organized. And there seems to be a lot of resistance, from that centralized model, and drifting towards a decentralized model, because somehow that fits our conception of how the economy works, and our minds can't quite get to thinking about this distributed model. I've raised a question as well of what happens to volume levels in each production site. There are some good reasons why particular things are produced in particular places, to do with specialization, to do with labor, to do with skills. So there's some quite significant challenges about the people and the companies that are needed to support this distributed model. So, thinking then about this possible shift from centralized production and how it occurs. Now, in the brackets, I've put for whatever reason. And sometimes that's because when we're thinking about these possible changes, we often wonder what the drivers could be of those changes. Now, I would love to be able to stand here and say that digital technologies themselves, including additive manufacturing, could be the driver for a change towards decentralized manufacturing. Unfortunately, I don't actually think that additive manufacturing or digital technologies together will be the drivers. I think that far more catastrophic, potentially, phenomenon, things like climate change, environmental disasters, are likely to actually be the drivers that are going to cause the impetus to want to have decentralized production, but that additive manufacturing could be one of the technologies that enables that once those drivers occur. In that scenario, we can think about labor costs. I've covered the idea that actually if your labor costs are going to increase, if you're reshoring activities, this opens up an opportunity for additive manufacturing to reduce those labor costs. Now, we all know, and we can look around the booths, and we can see that there have been, over the last couple of years, particularly significant advances in the automation around additive in order to fit into this idea of a factory of the future. But in order to reduce the amount of human input that is needed into additive manufacturing. And that's really crucial when we're thinking about these geographical shifts in production. When I come on to talk about our team and the work we do, one of the things that why we have people from a business school is also to remember that there are humans involved in production, and to think about what that human involvement is and what it means to the broader system. Scale. And I mentioned that you could overlap this decentralized network, and how we actually start to research how this could work and what the ideal scale could be for a distributed system. I think in some places the scales could be larger, and in others they could be smaller. I think that's probably quite geographically specific. I think I say on the slide that there's a chance there for additive manufacturing to become more competitive as scales are smaller, if these networks are very responsive and based on immediate need and demand. Of course, those of us who work in AM know about lots of talk and progress made in spare parts. It's considered one of the applications that AM could really significantly contribute to. And so work around digital inventories, spare parts, stopgap manufacturing means that there are opportunities because there's always going to be transition. We're not going to wake up one day and have decentralized or distributed production. There will always be transition, and that will take a very long time if that is where the journey ends. So additive could be really important during times of uncertainty and change. Constraints. So when we have these conversations, there are often many people who say, but. And there are many constraints. And we acknowledge that in our project. And we've written already about some of these constraints as we see them, what the barriers are to a distributed system. The diagram, which I hope you might be able to see, it did need to be a bit bigger, I think, is just something that I drew up to start thinking about how there's lots of conversations about these kind of distributed ideas at different scales. We have at the city level, things like Fab City, where you're trying to have circular economies and closed-loop systems in a distributed system within a city. Or that could be at the region or the nation. A lot of the political dialogue and conversations are about a national scale, about self-sufficiency for national economies. That certainly is the rhetoric in the UK. But then also up to a regionalised area within trading blocks, perhaps within the EU, for example. Coming back to the constraints, we see issues around governments and regulation, particularly around intellectual property rights, also around the information that you need to share being connected into a distributed network. As I've already emphasized, suddenly our emphasis thinking about materials and material supply chains, how raw materials are actually being shipped globally to support a distributed network. In no way would a distributed network be entirely self-sufficient unless it happened to overlay a geographical territory with all the materials that were needed, which is highly unlikely. So logistics become very important, particularly in pre-production. And if you're more localized to your consumer, your logistics at the end of the value chain become less significant, and they become more significant around materials. There's also issues around standardization and certification, around process development, emphasizing the importance of design for additive manufacturing. Infrastructure. Do particular countries, regions, territories have sufficient manufacturing capability and the labor force that is needed? One of the concerns in the UK around reshoring is that firms are wanting to bring back some production, and they're unable to, they don't know how to find suppliers. They're not connected into local manufacturing. And there is an organisation, Reshoring UK, that's trying to match up that production. But of course, it's a sector that's been underinvested in the UK for many decades. What is local? So often around sustainability we talk about local, and this diagram speaks to actually at what scale are we talking about. But then also thinking that there's a lot of uncertainty around what this means for companies and how they manage their business models. So that's another reason why we as people from business schools feel that we have some things, important things, to say to the AM community. So our project then. I promised to leave that to the end, and I've given you the context. I'd been working on additive manufacturing, looking at its capability to change the geographies of supply chains since about 2015. And I did much of that work on my own. My background as a geographer, so I'm very much interested in the spatial dynamics of how the global economy works. Then COVID hit. There was lots of talk around PPE, and there was funding, government funding for academics to help with the crisis. So I put in a grant around additive manufacturing and sharing best practice in the UK. It was unsuccessful, as were most applications. 0.6% were successful. I then teamed up with some colleagues, some of whom are sat over there. Hi. And they're in the engineering school at the University of Bristol. And we put in for a different kind of, a similar grant, also unsuccessful. But you keep trying, and we finally got some significant EPSRC funding for this project called Brokering Additive Manufacturing. And it brings together us from a business school and the engineers to work together to look at a cloud and agent-based distributed model using 3D printing with industry partners and engagement. We very much have to ground our ideas around what this distributed model could look like in the realities of what's happening in the business environment. So our business partners, our industry partners are really, really important to us. What we're doing is developing the theory, models, and technologies to make the AM machines think. At the end, I'll put where our booth is, and we have some Prussias that are all speaking to each other and printing. The printers are self-aware, and we're working with the parameters that you can give these machines, that you can set for them. Thinking about how long, the length of a print that they might want to accept. Thinking about what materials they might be using. You can link up to the cloud and pull down jobs based on that set of parameters. They are communicating to each other through the network, and they're linking to the cloud. And they're competing for jobs. So the jobs can also think, evaluating which machines to be manufactured on. So the rationale around our funding was actually talking about the UK context and thinking about how we could utilize the additive manufacturing capability that exists in the UK. And we were particularly interested in times of peak demand. So our starting point was PPE, but we acknowledge that PPE is hopefully a one-off and quite peculiar, but demonstrating this idea of industry coming together, changing supply, changing production methods in order to meet some peak demand. And we're also modeling different types of peak demand and thinking about how AM can be mobilized during those times. One of the reasons for that is that some of those constraints evaporate if you're operating in times of critical need. It might be that you're a bit less price sensitive. It might be that firms can collaborate in different ways that they wouldn't in the everyday. So we have found that these firms can work together to create the ephemeral supply chains, doing what's best for the network. So the network's resilient, scalable, flexible, secure, and responsive. And the control and the governance of machines remains with the owner. Now, when we come to trade shows, we start to see that actually, although we needed this rationale for the funders about UK manufacturing capability, of course this isn't a story that's unique to the UK, far from it. But also there are some significant constraints, like many firms would not want to connect their machines to a cloud, for example. But we're starting to see ways in which actually this technology could be deployed within firms or within collaborations of firms to form distributed networks. So there's many different segments and different levels, layers at which this distributed technology could be deployed. We're empirically testing a lot of our assumptions around the opportunities and the constraints for this. We are going to be setting up machines in different places across the southwest, across 4 different universities, all speaking to each other, but geographically apart. As I've said, we're exploring the parameters for these machines. So, our findings so far, with across additive manufacturing, we've been going around and interviewing firms in the UK, talking to them across the value chain, different firms, 3D printing machine manufacturers, material suppliers, covering the value chain of additive manufacturing. And there's a lot of interest in this idea, which resonates with some of the assumptions that I've been making about the challenges around manufacturing in general and the global economy. And there's quite a lot of excitement about the idea, but what we have got the impression is that when we're talking about this idea to firms, they think that this is something that could be happening in 10, 15 years. And what we're now trying to emphasize, and the reason we're here talking to everyone, is saying this can happen now rather than in the future. There are concerns around connecting to clouds, there's issues around security and issues around quality. So in no way do I mean to stand here today and say that we have all the answers. It's very much a starting point, and we acknowledge these constraints. But a collective understanding of them could work towards some solutions. And I think that solutions are probably different in different contexts in order to make this work. I get the sense there's a kind of lack of awareness of the different scenarios under which this model could work. As I said, there's the everyday. Could this work within a firm to help you manage your jobs, prioritizing jobs? The machines will decide for you which order to print. And it takes away some labor, some thought, and the machines are controlling that. Is this occasional? Could there be scope for a firm that does their everyday production, but then collects to the cloud to do some production overnight? An extra revenue stream, a way to make sure your machines are working for you. That could lead to more machines being bought, greater adoption. Is it exceptional, and is it extraordinary? And we're, as I said, modeling these kinds of scenarios around peak demand, where you could actually be ramping up, utilizing AM capacity in order to meet critical need at times of crisis. And we perhaps are heading towards more times of crisis. There is a general interest in extending the adoption of AM. I mean, that's why many of us are here. But I'm, in a way, preaching to the converted. I think there's probably quite a lot more work to be done in terms of reaching out to manufacturing in general and telling them about, talking about distributed manufacturing, and also emphasizing the role of additive manufacturing, because I think there's still a lot more work to be done in really convincing people around the adoption of AM to helping solve a lot of these issues and problems. And of course, we do also want to emphasize our starting point is additive manufacturing because we think the technology is incredible, but also there's no reason why these networks wouldn't exist with other types of manufacturing technologies, and perhaps theoretically they should do. And of course, we're going to see lots of different geographical supply chain configurations that are driving the increased adoption of additive manufacturing. And if we look at the global economy as a whole, still the adoption of additive manufacturing is going to be geographically uneven, and perhaps these changes in the supply networks might lessen the divide between those countries where there's very poor adoption of additive and those where there's high levels of additive manufacturing. So, I'd like to ask anyone who's listening if they'd like to get involved. At the moment, our conversations with industry have been based in the UK, but as we're here in Germany, I'm always very happy to talk to other firms and get an international perspective. We as a team will be applying for further funding, so this is very much a starting point for us. We will be looking at developing our software, our solutions around this. Always keen to talk to firms who think that they could use or supplement or complement. At the moment, we're using open source software and we developed our own. We can come and see the Prushas speaking to each other. We're in Hall 12.1, A132. So please do come and see us. And we've got 6 of us on the team who can talk to you in detail about anything you might be interested in. So the big clock counting down tells me I have 3 minutes, so I think I've done okay. So I'd like to say thank you very much for listening and perhaps a bit more time for questions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Exciting presentation. Any questions here from the audience so far? My question would be, Jennifer, if I heard about the product, it sounds a little bit like to me like a platform for me, where I can send in an order. The platform looks for the perfect printer or perfect setup to print out my parts, and then I get it back, right? Is that the right understanding? So first question would be, what is your interest as university to step into something? And I mean, it has a commercial focus. And let's say this experiment is super successful. How is this then transferred into like in an economic environment? Don't get me wrong. I mean, you can't do it university-based for ages. So is there like a step afterwards where you bring it into real life?
Yeah, the project only lasted 18 months. Significant funding, but still only over 18 months. So really for us, it was a kind of a proof of concept, really, to get the machines, to get them speaking, and then engage with industry to think about what the challenges are, where we might head. Yeah. So the emphasis now is on us as researchers to gain further funding. And we do that by connecting in and saying this is how we can solve significant issues that are challenging manufacturing. The process then to commercialize that is rather different, and that's where my engineering colleagues take over.
Okay, very good. And the next question, I mean, there are companies like 3Your, for example, which today do exactly the same. But
if you think about 3D printing hub, where you said you'd get the product back, this is where the product might not come back to you, it might go somewhere else.
Yeah, okay. So it's a different approach, you think? Okay. Then the next thing is, I mean, you were talking a lot about labor costs and the reason why we moved to China, and I totally agree in the fact that it will be probably only the crisis that bring us a step further into the development of additive and reshoring. The other side, in my opinion, is always we tend to forget quite quickly as humans, and price is finally always the main argument that is driving us, because we as consumer, we don't want to pay double or 3 times the price. The industry wants to produce as cheap as possible. So how realistic do you see the whole topic of reshoring using additive manufacturing for the near future?
I think there's a very practical level, and actually a lot of academics are working on this assumption that supply chains are driven by profit maximization. And now as we think around a sustainability agenda, there are sectors where the value proposition of a firm can be more dependent on their sustainability criteria, and that means price is less important. And you can charge more for your product if your sustainability criteria are higher. So the business models can change, but I think still we're quite some way from that.
I mean, we just experienced here in Germany the example of Audi that claimed to be very sustainable focus, and they enter Formula One again in 26. So this is a highly discussed topic at the moment. So the topic of greenwashing is all around us. So it's really interesting to see what are the real powerful interests and drivers in the end. But I'm totally with you. We all would be glad to drive the topic of reshoring and having such concepts.
Yeah, I have a PhD student who's halfway through a PhD looking at reshoring also in Brazil, because we're very conscious that the story around reshoring has been about bringing manufacturing back to advanced economies. What happens in the global south then? So my student's from Brazil, so she's going to be looking at manufacturing and textiles in Brazil and the UK, interviewing firms and following these supply chain arrangements and seeing what's happened. Her initial observations at the moment is towards this decentralized regional systems where the reshoring's happening across Latin America and Central America.
Yeah, but last question, is that something that you consider in terms of what would be the impact on the world economy afterwards? Because of course it's super logical to do reshoring and bring it back and do it professionally there, but what happens with countries like Brazil, for example, that are dependent on the productivity level and amount they have today?
I absolutely have no idea what the answer to that question is, and I wish I had a crystal ball.
Well, but it's good.
Academics tend not to make predictions about the future because it's written down and then we're held hostage to what we said 5 years ago.
So let me sum up. As I said to you before the speech, that I was very excited about the topic, and you met all my expectations, over-exceed them. So super happy that you had you here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much for being with us. Jennifer Jones, please.
Thank you, everyone.
Applause. Thank you. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we proceed with the program of today, and we are going to look into a very interesting country that we are partnering this year, and this is the country France, because it's one of the most important countries if it comes to additive manufacturing in Europe, and they are strongly represented at Formnext this year. And this is why they are our partner country, and we want to give them a stage here at the AM4U area and get to know some of their exciting companies, research organizations, university, and different sectors they are presenting to us. And we do have a highlight block yet. So stay tuned and you will see all this after our highlight block.